Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and today I'd like to teach you how to cut your scraps into 5-inch squares. And we're going to be using those squares in the Friendship Quilt Along. So this is block number 1 from the Friendship Quilt Along. As you can see, it's a super-sized scrappy star block, and you're going to need 20 5-inch squares to get started. So in this video, I want to teach you how to take a rough cut scrap and be able to trim that down into a usable 5-inch square, and how to do that so it is straight in line with the grain line of the fabric, so that way it's going to be super easy to piece. So let's get started learning how to cut up our scraps together. So here I have a scrap of fabric, and I think I can get a 5-inch square out of the scrap. So the first thing I'm going to do is work off of one of the long edges, and I think looks like I've got a bit of selvage there on one side, and then I've cut this side. So I'm going to just pull on some of those cut threads to make it fray. And what this is doing is it's going to give me a straight edge, or just a straight line that I can see clearly on the edge of the fabric, and that is straight with the grain line of the fabric. You know, it's running in line with those threads. Now this is important because you could cut a 5-inch square, as you can see, all kinds of wonky angles on this scrap, but we really want it to be straight with the grain line of the fabric, because that means that all of the pieces we're going to cut out of that 5-inch square will be nice and straight and square too. And this means that all of the pieces are going to act the right way when we go to piece. They're not going to really fray excessively or stretch crazy out of shape. So this is some of the reasons why we really want to cut always with the grain line of the fabric when we're piecing. Okay, so I have this lined up, and I am left-handed, so I'm going to be cutting always with the rotary cutter in my left hand, and I'm just going to slice right along that line, and that is parallel with that frayed edge, that edge that I pulled the threads. It's nice and parallel to that. Okay, I have a little spinning rotary mat here, so I can spin this around real easy because I want to continue to cut with my dominant hand. And now I'm going to line up the 5-inch line on the ruler with the edge I just cut. Now, if you don't have a spinning mat, all you'll do is just pick it up and flip it over. It's not a big deal. Okay, now I'm lining up that 5-inch mark dead, and you want to make sure whenever you're cutting to include the line that you're cutting to on the ruler. So I'm making sure that that's lined up nicely, and I'll press firmly and cut again. There we go. So now we basically have a strip of fabric, and if this was longer, then we could cut multiple 5-inch squares out of it, but it's pretty short, so I think we're only going to get one square out of this scrap. So I'm going to line up now, and I'm lining up 2 thin lines on the ruler. It can be any lines. This is just making sure that I've got a line lined up here and a line down here, just making sure that that's parallel, and that means that this line's going to be nice and straight to the grain line of the fabric too. So here we go. Make sure it's nice and straight. And I like to use the thin lines of the ruler just because they're easier to see. That's the only reason why I do that. There we go. And spin it around again. And then now with this cut, I'm going to line up 3 things. I'm going to line up the 5-inch line on the ruler, 2 thin lines on the ruler with the top and bottom, because I want to make sure I'm cutting a nice, straight, square 5-inch square. There we go. That looks good. And you might be wondering about this little extra bit of scrap. We've got our 5-inch square. From that, we can make any of the blocks from our Friendship Quilt Along, but we have this little extra piece. Well, you are going to also need 2-inch squares, 1.5-inch squares, 3-inch squares, 4-inch squares, you know, pretty much everything within the 5-inch shape. So whatever you can go on ahead and cut this down into will certainly save you some time, and it will provide you with more pieces for you to pull from. So I'm lining this up, and it looks like I can get a 2-inch square, or at least a 2-inch strip out of that. So I'm going to go on ahead and trim that on that side, and now I'll arrange it this way. And I already know that those edges are nice and straight and square, so I can line up down here, and it looks like I can get some nice 2-inch squares out of this little piece. So when you're cutting up your scraps, First, you want to try and cut as many 5-inch squares out of them as you can, and then if you have lots of little pieces left over, then it's just a matter of looking at it and saying, okay, well, I can get some more 2-inch squares or 1.5-inch squares out of it as well, and going ahead and make those cuts too. So there we go. That is how you cut up your scraps into squares. We're going to be using lots of 5-inch squares for our friendship block of the month. Basically, with every block, I'll have a certain number of squares that you need to start with. So for instance, this block number 1, you need 20 squares to start with. And then from those squares, we cut out smaller pieces. So let's talk about that next. What if you need to make a lot of smaller pieces from your 5-inch square? Well, I have a lot of diagrams included in block 1 that will guide you, but one example is to be able to cut a 2.5-inch square plus 3 2-inch squares. So if that's what I'm going to be cutting, I'm going to be trying to cut 4 pieces out of this 5-inch square. Here's what I do. The first thing I'm going to do is line up the edge of the ruler with the edge of that 5-inch square. Make sure it's nice and straight. And I'm going to cut a 2.5-inch strip out of this square, just like that. And then now I'll rotate it around, and you kind of want to check yourself. You know, if you've cut your squares and they've been in a bin, you know, maybe the edges have gotten banged up a little bit, it might not be perfectly square. You know, it might have kind of gotten a little wonky. So you want to line it up and make sure you can line up a line on the top, a line on the bottom, and that 2.5-inch mark, and everything's lined up nice and straight so you're getting your full shape. And you want to also make sure, remember, include the line on the ruler. That's really important. This looks good, so I can cut my 2.5-inch square. Now I want to cut some 2-inch squares. So now I'm going to line up the edge I just cut with the 2-inch mark on my ruler. I'm going to use some of these thin lines here so that way I can really see what I'm doing. Just like so. So I've got thin lines lined up on the top and bottom and the 2-inch mark over here. There we go, that looks good. Trim that off. And now I'll rotate and I'll make one more cut to take this down to a 2-inch square. Just like so. So there's my 2-inch square. Now I'm going to take this leftover piece that I have, line up the 2-inch mark on the ruler, and turn that into a 2-inch wide strip. That looks good. And again, this is subcutting. Basically, I'm taking that 5-inch square and I'm subcutting it down into smaller units. Now you may be wondering about 2.5-inch squares. You know, we're starting with a 5-inch. You might be wondering about 2.5-inch squares. Well, I did a lot of cutting, obviously, for this pattern, and I found that it was just a little tight. So I did a lot of experimenting with that particular size, you know, taking a 5-inch square and cutting 4 2.5-inch squares out of it. And I found that I could always easily cut that 2.5-inch wide strip, but sometimes that other strip just did not quite come out. It didn't come out at the full 2.5 inches, and that could throw off your piecing if it's not measuring the right size exactly. Now, the one time I would say that's okay is if you are turning those squares into half square triangles, because with half square triangles, we always cut big, and then after the half square triangle is made, we trim it down to the proper size. So I'd say it's okay for that, but for the most part, if you have a pattern, one of the blocks, and it's needing lots of 2.5-inch squares, and they're left as squares, not as half square triangles, then I would say you're going to need to cut out one at a time, just like I just showed you, where you cut out the 2.5-inch square first, and then use the rest of the space in that square to cut out 2-inch squares. And it's for this reason that cutting from squares, cutting from anything pre-cut, is not going to be as efficient as cutting from yardage. And I have lots of other videos on how to cut strips, how to, square the fabric, all that good stuff. I'll make sure to link that up. But basically, you should know that cutting from squares is going to be less efficient. Obviously, you're going to have a lot more waste here, but the benefit is you get to use up your scraps That's a great benefit. And then another great benefit is you get such a beautiful, scrappy, happy look. You know, this block really wouldn't look as cheerful and fun if it wasn't for all of these beautiful fabrics on the surface. So that's it for this tutorial. I hope you learned a lot and you're excited about cutting up your fabric scraps into squares. Remember, you're going to need a lot of other smaller units other than 5-inch squares for the Friendship Quilt Along. I know for this particular block number 1, you're also going to need 1.5-inch squares, 2.5-inch squares, and I want to say 3-inch squares as well. You'll need to check the pattern, and you can find it at leahday.com/friendship. So you're going to need lots of different sizes. So if your scraps don't cut into perfect 5-inch squares, please don't panic. Cut it into the next size square, and we'll eventually use up all of those pieces in this quilt along. I promise. We're going to have so many fun sizes and shapes and really cool units to play with. For this particular block, we're going to learn how to make a half square triangle, and that's going to be in a new tip video coming up soon. I really hope that you'll join in the fun of the Friendship Quilt Along. All you need to do is pick up the new block patterns that come out every single month. And you can find them all at leahday.com/friendship. Until next time, let's go quilt.